Welcome to the first episode of Message Makers, where we dive into the insight, experience and expertise in the comms world. And I'm really happy to be joined by Beth Fear from Capgemini today. So welcome, Beth. You've been in comms for a little while now. You've worked across a whole range of different industries. I wonder if you could just give us a sense of that journey that you've been on.
Sure, absolutely. So I actually started out in internal communications by accident. I was doing a PR degree whilst working in a call centre at the time, and there was a gap when it came to engagement, incentives and communication. So I put myself forward to plug that gap, and before I knew it, I was a communications advisor. And as you can imagine, the head of communications at the time found out about me, wasn't impressed that we'd invented this role. And then thankfully a bit further down the line, she said that a vacancy had become available in her team, and did I want to go for that and be a bit more aligned to the strategy and that side of things. And I thought at the time, do you know what? Yes, I do. And I went for it. So here I am today, having worked in a number of sectors, including financial, retail, engineering and IT. And I've also had a dabble in contracting as well.
It's an interesting journey, and I started out working in a contact centre and kind of made my own role as well. So you're not the only one. It's interesting as well with that PR degree. Like, how much of that has been relevant through your career, Beth?
It's an interesting one because a lot of people ask me that question, and the way that I try and position it is, I find that I'm not communicating obviously with media, I'm communicating with employees, and I feel that there's a lot of similarities in terms of understanding your audience and your key messages and things like that. But I feel that the reputation side, obviously it's an internal reputation rather than external reputation. So I do find that I bring some of the theory, I would say, that I learned from my degree into what I do in internal comms.
There's a lot of different paths into a comms role, and I think there are so many similarities. And what we see a lot of, particularly with content and messaging, is kind of creating once and then using across channels. So it's really interesting to hear kind of people with different backgrounds. So you kind of touched on the fact that you've dabbled in consulting, and I think that leads us on to where you are now at Capgemini. So maybe just tell us a little bit about that organisation. What does that role look like, and what might people not realise about that organisation, and maybe some of the nuances of communicating there?
Yeah, of course. So I am currently the Senior Internal Comms Manager for the Cloud Infrastructure Services sector. So it's like a global business line within Capgemini. The bit that people tend not to realise sometimes is how big Capgemini is. So in my area alone, there are 34,000 employees. Across the whole company, there's 340,000 employees. And just for those that may not know, Capgemini, it's a multinational information technology services and consulting company. So we have such a wide variety of clients. We offer a lot of services, and it's one of those businesses where there is always something to learn. So it's been quite fascinating on this journey so far. The current role I do is business partnering our Chief HR Officer, as well as coordinating our regional communications team. In terms of what's different, what the challenges are, I think obviously it's such a large, complex organisation with a really diverse workforce. And as I say, I find it fascinating, in all honesty, but we obviously, as a comms team, have to regularly think about the tone, the language, the timing, the channels, and working closely with stakeholders across the business so that we're making sure that obviously all our comms are aligned with our strategy. Duplication is a big thing because there's so many different teams, obviously, across the 340,000 employees, all wanting to do kind of the best job we can. When it comes to communications. And of course, anything we do has to resonate across the world. It's not just what Beth in Yorkshire thinks. It's, what does that mean for somebody in India, Egypt, America, Europe? So one of the things that people might not realise is just how much of our work is about enabling the dialogue. So our CEO and our leaders here appreciate the value of, creating space to connect. I think the connection and the clarity in a business like ours can make all the difference.
And that's certainly something that I've seen a lot more of, is that communications has become a lot more about tell and a lot more about that connectivity and conversation. So it's interesting that kind of that's a key focus in your business. Just thinking about that kind of journey that you've been on, you mentioned a few of the different industries that you've worked in. So is there any similarities? Is there anything that's kind of stayed the same?
What I would say is that every industry I've worked in has its own like rhythm, language, culture, approach. So as an example, for construction, the communications we did had to be incredibly practical. There was a lot of focus on safety, logistics, and making sure everything was like clear instructions. Retail, as you can imagine, I'd say it was fast-paced, very people-centric, and obviously a big emphasis on the frontline engagement of everyone, obviously in the stores and things like that. Financial services, now that was an eye-opener with all, obviously, the layers of complexity around regulation and things like that had to be considered. And then if I think about consultancy, I think that was really about agility and innovation, and especially at Capgemini, there was a lot around needing to collaborate globally. So what would be the consistent? I'd say across all of them, probably clarity, trust, relevance. I think that no matter what sector you work in, people want to understand what's going on, why it matters, how it affects them. And I guess they want to hear it in a way that feels human and authentic. So I'd say that that's where I felt I've been consistent throughout the places I've worked.
It's that thing of big picture message and then kind of distilling it down to what does that mean for me, I guess.
Yeah.
You've been in this industry a while, seen lots of tools come and go. But what are the tried and tested methods that you rely on and have done for your entire career, Beth?
Well, yeah, there's no shortage of tools in internal comms at the moment, isn't there? Is there? Because there's just so much kind of coming out there from videos and AI and podcasting materials and things like that. But I think, in all honesty, for me, the most effective methods are still the simple ones. So I always come back to audience mapping and getting the what does it mean for me bit nailed. So obviously, who you're talking to, what they care about, how your message lands with them. Obviously, that's fundamental. So I remember just giving a brief example here. Back in the days when I worked for one of the supermarkets, it involved communicating with people that worked in our manufacturing sites. And I had no idea what it was like to work in an abattoir or on a produce line in a bakery, for example. So I asked to go and visit because I wanted to understand what a day in the life of our employees in those working conditions was, and how did it affect them in the way that we communicated with them and what mattered to them. So I'll spare you the details, but I'm so glad I did that because it really opened my eyes to how just doing comms in the way that I was used to wouldn't work for them. So it needed to be tailored, it needed to be unique and bespoke for them in their situation and their working environment. And I guess that stuck with me ever since. One size doesn't fit all when it comes to communications, and your audience is key.
Is that something that you would kind of approach manually, or do you use a system or a tool to facilitate that?
It's just a simple table that I tend to try and use with the kind of project owners or stakeholders who I'm working with, and it's who are our audience, and it's often that conversation of don't say all employees because we need to be more specific. So can we work out what part of this communication does a manager need to know versus somebody working on the front line, for example, and I try and audience map it through of, who are our key receivers of this communication, what do they need to know and why? And then I kind of try and encourage them to help me, work through this because it gets them thinking about it too. And, a lot of key messages come from doing that exercise. A lot of people say, just work out 3 messages or 3 key messages, but yes, we can have the generic key messages that work across the board, but we also need the messages that resonate with specific audiences and personas too.
And that point around hard to reach audiences, I started my career, you started your career in a contact center, which is a very different set of pressures. Is there anything that you've tried that's really worked, that's resonated with some of those kind of hard to reach audiences that you've worked with over the years? Face
to face is always a winner. Because obviously then that opens the opportunity to ask questions. You're hearing it firsthand. It's not being a cascaded, passed on message. Yeah, I always try where I can, especially if it's like a transformation change project, to encourage some sort of face to face. And I know that these days there's the hybrid working side of things as well. especially in a global business like ours, not the face-to-face side of things isn't always possible, but trying to do like interactive team sessions, drop-in sessions, coffee chats, that kind of thing, where it's informal but intentional, I'd say. That would always be my kind of go-to.
And you mentioned there the global nature of the business and the challenges that sometimes presents, like just the logistics of time zones and distance between people. How do you overcome that, and what do you do when it comes to localization and cultural differences between those different territories?
Yeah, this is something, and I'd say I'm still learning. I joined Capgemini in 2019, and we've got an amazing regional comms team. So when I say, obviously, we sit in the global comms team, we've then got our regional comms team, which sit in each of the countries where we operate. And from day one, we've always had these regular team meetings where, we would bring to the table what we're working on from a global perspective. We'd encourage them to share what's going on at a local perspective, because those conversations are key in terms of aligning, making sure there's no duplication, but also we need to know that from our global standpoint, when we're sending out a message, is it going to resonate with people in, their local culture, their local language? There's also things like legislation, union involvement and things like that. And even how people want to receive their information in different countries is different. And, for example, in France, everything has to be translated into French. I can't speak French, so I often heavily rely on our regional comms lady to help me translate things. And obviously that comes with okay, if I need to send this communication out, I need to think about my timings, because not only have I got to do the normal kind of prepare, write, approve, I've also got to leave time for translation too for France. Another example would be time zones. Obviously play a huge factor whenever we're planning an event. We've got to try and make sure that it works for India versus America. I think we found our rhythm and routine with that now, but again, we've tried and tested a number of different times throughout the day. But I think, it all comes down to just being intentional about planning and being flexible, I suppose, and to really collaborate with your stakeholders and your team across the world. Building strong relationships within the company have been the best thing I could have done.
I think that translation piece is so important, but just mentally adjusting for those timescales and timelines. I think we've worked with clients who've got audiences in Canada, and I think there's areas there where there's a legal requirement for translation, but obviously it's a different kind of dialect of French than in France as well. So you need to bear that in mind, which I'm sure you've come across. And then in terms of working with those regional teams and the messages, I mean, because you don't want to end up in a situation where the audience has got kind of global messages, regional messages, team messages, kind of different hierarchies of messages. How do you overcome that, or is that something that's kind of a dynamic piece?
In our regular meetings, we have like a planner where obviously we can highlight what we're working on, what's up and coming, like key dates for the diary from a global standpoint. We often ask for feedback, is there anything going to get in the way of this being a success locally? Have you got any big events planned at a country level? Is there anything else that you're aware of? There's, national days of celebration across the world as well, bank holidays and things like that. So it's just about working really collaboratively as a team. In addition to that, whenever we do work on a global campaign, we kind of try and provide that toolkit where we hand it over and then they can adapt and make it work locally for their audience. So, what channels are more effective in their country? Does this wording, this language work on this topic for your country and your culture? So I think the toolkit has been a really good way of us overcoming some of those barriers or maybe resistance to some of the messages we try to push out. But we also do a lot around, involving local voices, getting their inputs on some of the events that we want to run. Because, we're quite passionate about being inclusive. We want everyone to bring their own self to work. and we want to hear those voices from across the world as well, because we've got a lot to learn from each other. So whenever we're developing a campaign or an announcement, getting that regional input from colleagues, and it helps us spot potential pitfalls, but it also helps us build something really inclusive, which then again resonates better with people across the world.
So it's that kind of collaborative planning, and then toolkits that can be localized and regionalized and to the different audiences that are kind of the key takeaways there, I think.
And obviously having a collaborative regional comms team that we can tap into helps us bring that to life.
I ended up downloading like a little widget on for my computer when we're working on international projects, so I can kind of have visibility of the time zone for the area that we're working with, because it just helps you kind of get into that mindset. And I think you mentioned events a few times and kind of trying to find the right point to schedule those during the day. I don't think there is any right answer for that. We've done various projects where it's either kind of picking the best day, the best time that works for the most people, or running it a couple of different times, making things available on replay. So I don't know kind of if those are some of the tactics that you've used as well.
Yeah, we've got some events where we don't record because they're meant to be these speak freely sessions where we want people to be able to ask a question. We want people to speak freely about the topic, and we don't often record those, and so they feel quite exclusive in a way, and they get good attendance. But then where we've got the big strategic messages, the town halls, the leadership kind of announcements, we do record those just to make sure that if for any reason people can't make it on that day or that time, they've got the opportunity to listen back. And I think, we work quite heavily with clients, and sometimes people have commitments with clients as well. So we don't want to take them away from delivering a service for our clients either. So yeah, we have to be mindful of all those things.
It's interesting, the speak freely sessions. Is that the terminology you use with the audience? Or are they very aware of when things are and aren't being recorded?
Yep. So it's part of an initiative we're doing. It's around inclusion. Obviously, it's a huge topic. We're quite passionate about being inclusive as a business. And so one of the kind of initiatives that's being led in our area at the moment is this Speak Freely campaign, where we will come up with a theme based on feedback from our engagement survey, what people are sharing on there that we maybe need to dig a bit deeper on. And we'll kind of open the lid on it and just say, come to this session, we want to talk about this topic. It won't be recorded. Ask questions, share your voice and your opinions, and let's see where we get to. We often take, obviously, things away from those sessions. If needed, we escalate. If we can influence and change things, we do. Or if it needs a bigger, further discussion, we plan what that looks like as well.
And how are those being received, or is it early days?
I think there's that trust element of people of like, are you sure I can ask that question? Am I okay to share my personal view? And I think the more that we do them, and the more that people see that there's no repercussions as such, I think they'll become more and more popular.
I'd be really interested to see how they go. It's making a space for people to be able to speak freely sounds like a really powerful tool. And then thinking about kind of current challenges and opportunities that you're facing, what is the one biggest comms challenge that you're facing right now, Beth?
I'd say probably managing constant change. Whether it's organisational shifts, new ways of working, new tech, return to office. There's just, evolving expectations from our people. There's just always something moving, isn't there, at the moment? And I think our job is obviously to help people make sense of it, which I love, but I also feel the pressure. I guess it's finding the right balance with how we continue to communicate effectively on all these changing, moving subjects, and giving people enough clarity and direction without overwhelming them as such.
So we can't have a conversation about comms without touching on AI. And I know when we spoke before, you mentioned that Capgemini are doing a lot of work with clients on AI as well. So is that filtering through to the work you do in the comms team? Are you experimenting with it? Have you found any successes anywhere?
Yeah, I have blogged a bit about this on LinkedIn actually recently. It's definitely my new creative comms buddy, or is it a creative comms buddy or is it my doer? I do the thinking, AI does the doing, I think is how I'm positioning it at the moment. But yeah, to be honest, I've used it for all sorts in my current role. I think one of the things I enjoy the most is asking it to push my thinking. So, for example, if I was working on a strategy or trying to shift how we communicate, I'd ask it things like, how could I make this more impactful for a non-technical audience, or challenge this idea, what am I missing? There's various prompts that I've kind of got used to giving it to challenge my kind of challenge the norm in terms of what I always go to in terms of my approach to internal comms. So but yes, as a business for Capgemini, there's a really strong global focus on responsible AI. So we've got access to approved tools and a huge amount of training to help us make sure that we're using them safely and effectively. And I guess the emphasis is on using AI to support our work, not replace it. And alongside that, making sure that we're thinking about the ethics, data privacy, and our long-term impact, really.
And then measurement and ROI are always kind of topics that come up. And I think what I've found over the years is it can often be a bit of an afterthought. Is, okay, we've done all the communicating, whatever that might look like, whatever channels we've used, whatever the messages are, or how do we measure it? Have you kind of cracked the nut of measurement at Capgemini? Have you got any secret silver bullets to share?
For me personally, I would say I've traditionally focused on things like, attendance at events, read rates, likes, clicks, all of those things. But I guess where I'm at now is they only tell part of the story. And so what I'm trying to do is shift towards kind of measuring outcomes rather than just outputs these days. So instead of asking, did people read this? I'm trying to ask, did it change anything? What behaviour did it change?
I think that's the important point is establishing at the start, isn't it? That what is the measure of success? What is the behaviour you want to shift? And if you don't know that beforehand, then firstly, should you be communicating it? But secondly, how do you measure that? And I think as well, you can't measure everything, and I think there's too much of a focus on that. And I heard stories before. I'm sure you've come across this. Like if you're trying to communicate around one topic, but there's issues around pension or pay or something that's really emotive, that one can bleed over into the other. So each piece of communication doesn't exist in isolation. So moving on, there is there a campaign or a project or a piece of communication from your history that you're particularly proud of that you can share with everyone?
Do you know, I'm going to actually talk about something I've done just recently, actually, because I think it's a really nice piece of work, and I'm not trying to blow my own trumpet here, but I've just recently launched a new people hub. It basically started as a really simple idea based on feedback that I was hearing from people not knowing where to find certain people-related information. So, things that matter to people in their career, learning, career growth, well-being, CSR, all those important topics. So I just kind of started to think a bit about, what does that mean? What does that look like? How could we make this better? And, wanted to introduce a clear, easy to navigate space where our global employees could find the things that mattered to them. And that's where it began, really. I started to design something to try and simplify this experience and give people that global lens on our HR priorities. But at the same time, obviously still having to respect the local tools and policies that existed. So this wasn't kind of about replacing what was already there, because that would have been huge. It was more around connecting the dots and making things easier to find for people. So it was a bit of a challenge to start with, because I'd never built a space like that myself before. But, I got a few of the team involved, and we quickly created this basic structure on SharePoint. And then I spent time working on the content with our HR leadership team. And, it was a real kind of roll your sleeves up and get stuck in moment for me as well, because I wasn't just writing about this or promoting it. I was building it, I was creating it at the same time. And I guess that kind of it reminded me how powerful, communications can be when it's rooted in empathy. And I understood the need of people, because I myself have struggled in some instances to find what I was looking for. Anyway, this launched in July, and we're seeing really great results already. It's obviously early days, but we're getting really good traction on the site, and we've received some qualitative feedback too, around, this is great, I can now find what I'm looking for. I just have to come here and it's like a one-stop shop. And so now we're looking at what phase 2 of that could look like, so that we continue to make it work smarter for our people.
But it almost calls back to that audience mapping point that you made earlier around like understanding what people's need is and then finding a way to solve that rather than kind of communicating what you think is the right solution. So there's a real kind of thread there in your approach, I think.
Definitely. And I think it's, it's made me realise that sometimes the best communications work can happen when you sometimes step out of the traditional comms lane as well. I've said it wasn't just about me writing and promoting about this hub. I was building it, I was shaping it with people to make sure it worked and it had an impact, it had an effect on people. So yeah, I think I'd say the main thing I've learned from doing that would be to stay curious and just ask, questions and delve a bit deeper.
You're so right as well. I'm really lucky to kind of go in and out of lots of different businesses, and quite often the most powerful thing is to ask the kind of the silly question of, well, why are you doing it like that? Why are you approaching it like that? And I think, sometimes kind of, like you say, stepping outside, getting that different perspective can be super powerful. We're going to get controversial now. So we've said earlier there's lots of tools, a plethora of tools, kind of more channels that you can shake a stick at, and those have kind of only grown over recent years. If you could switch off one channel or one activity, just stop doing something, what would it be and why?
I'm going to say, it's nothing specific, but I'd probably say I'd stop any channel or activity that it's become more of a habit than a purpose. Like sometimes we keep things going because they've always been there, like a newsletter or a podcast or a weekly update, for example. If it's not adding value or sparking that conversation or having an impact, it's, I guess, worth asking whether it's still serving a purpose. So I'd stop those things, and I don't necessarily know what that is for me right now, but that would be it.
Again, going back to your kind of audience mapping, there's the other side of that is channel mapping, right? That kind of channel audit piece, and I think people often view that as kind of, a big kind of thing. But I think, having a kind of a regular, ongoing appraisal of the channels that you've got and whether they're still fit for purpose is kind of part of making sure that everybody can access the information that they need in different ways. But if you end up with a channel that's there just because it's always been there, actually having the bravery to stand up and go, why are we doing that? Should we approach it differently? Should we turn it off? I think that can be really powerful. Yeah.
We do like a quarterly audit on all our channels where we look at, the traction. There's no point carrying on doing a newsletter if nobody's actually clicking on it and reading it. There needs to be another way of getting that information across that's more impactful. So yeah, channels are definitely something that are a big part of what we do.
I mean, that data must be incredibly rich then if you're kind of auditing on a quarterly basis. Are there any trends or anything really interesting that's come out of that you've seen?
Something that was really fascinating for us, which we're still trying to get our heads around a little bit, is we kind of tried to turn to more digital ways of communicating, so stepping away from email and trialing, these short, snappy videos. And we've only done a pilot so far of, rather than sending this in an email, what would it look like as a TikTok style video? And for some, they loved it, but for quite a lot of our audience, they weren't sure. And we found that quite interesting in terms of, we thought that would be a huge hit. So we're just trying to unpick that a little bit and understand, what kind of video would you like if we did go down that route a bit more?
I'm going to kind of try and bring everything together, because you've mentioned a few things. You've mentioned audience mapping. You've mentioned kind of keeping a track of your channels. You've mentioned kind of making spaces to connect. What would be the key thing that you've learned over your career in comms, Beth?
I'd say start with curiosity. Ask why. I love to do that, and it reminds me of a determined toddler when I go in and just go, why? Never be afraid to ask questions is the one thing I've taken away. It's okay to be vulnerable as well. Whether it's challenging how we say something or digging into what people really want to hear, or even if it's asking myself, a question around, could I be clearer? Could I be kinder or more useful in how I'm communicating? I think curiosity is definitely what's kept me learning and listening and wanting to improve.
Yeah, I think that can be super powerful. Look, I really appreciate you spending the time. It's been a really interesting conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for coming on, Beth.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Message Makers. Thanks so much to Beth for joining me and sharing her insight. If you've got any thoughts, questions or suggestions for guests, please do get in touch. And we'll be back soon with more conversations from across the world of comms.